Okay, so let's unpack this one.
Oh, yeah.
We're about to take a real deep dive into Nauru.
Right. An island nation many people might not know much about.
Exactly. Its history, the challenges. Quite a unique story.
And think of this as, well, your shortcut to getting your head around it. It's fascinating, but complex.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this stack of source material from you, the listener.
Yeah, everything from history, geography.
Economy, environment, culture, all of it.
Right.
And our mission really is to pull out the key bits.
The most important nuggets, yeah.
Yeah.
Helping you understand what's really significant in all this stuff.
And there is quite a bit to cover.
For sure. So Nauru, it's this tiny island republic, South Pacific.
That's right. About 1,300 kilometers northeast of Brisbane.
So quite remote.
Yeah.
Between the Solomon and Marshall Islands.
Exactly. And tiny is the word, just 21 square kilometers.
Wow. That makes it, what, third smallest country?
One of the very smallest, yeah. The sources are clear on that.
And its geography is pretty distinct.
Very. The sources paint a picture of this oval shape, about 5.9 kilometers long, 4.5 kilometers wide.
Okay.
And it's got this structure, 2 ridges, a central plateau inside that, and then it's all surrounded by a coral reef.
And not very high. You mentioned the highest point, Command Ridge.
Yeah, the sources give slightly different figures, maybe 60, 71 meters. One source specifically says 61 meters when talking climate change impacts.
So very low-lying overall.
Definitely. There's a white sandy beach on the west, some lagoons, swamps inland.
And for much of its recent history, it's all been about phosphate.
That's the defining story, really. Discovered around 1900.
Huge income in the 70s, the sources say.
Immense wealth.
Yeah.
But then depletion.
And that led to a major decline.
A fundamental shift in the island's whole trajectory. It's quite the boom and bust story.
It really is fascinating how one resource shaped everything.
Absolutely.
So let's trace that journey using the sources. Earliest days, colonization, the wealth, the collapse.
And the challenges Nauru faces right now.
Okay, let's rewind then. Back to the island's formation, its early history.
All right. The forces describe a really long geological history. We're talking tens of millions of years back.
Wow.
Early volcanism, maybe 12 million years ago or more.
Okay.
Then this uplifting period, about 2.5 billion years ago, that created an atoll-like structure with a central lagoon.
And the plateau came later?
Yeah. Later coral growth formed the plateau and these rift valleys you still see.
And you mentioned it used to be bigger, about 30 square kilometers.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. But about 3/4 of that original area mined away.
Mined away. That's stark.
It is. The island itself is divided into 14 sub-districts called Aitua.
Okay.
10 were habitable land, traditionally. The other 4 were just, unproductive rock. Gives you a sense of how little usable land there was to begin with.
And the sources mentioned freshwater lakes, Puwata, Yaren.
That's right. Those and others like Nibok, Iwa, Iwo, plus the Lucky Lakes.
But they were impacted by mining early on.
Heavily. Mostly exploited for phosphate, even before World War II. So fresh water was an issue from way back.
And the climate.
Pretty steady, no real seasons, average temp around 28 Celsius.
And cyclones are rare.
Thankfully, yes, according to the sources.
Okay, so going even further back, 60 million years maybe for the island itself, fossils suggest that.
That's the timescale mentioned, yeah. Early life plants like sago palm, screw pine, animals like lizards, birds probably arrived by wind or sea currents, slowly building things up.
And people arrived much later, developing a culture.
Yes, the sources show that by about 300 years before Europeans arrived, a sophisticated Paleolithic culture was already there.
What did that look like?
They worked stone, tubular lime, used shells, and they had complex agriculture.
Really? How so?
Stone barriers, wells, even irrigation systems. Quite advanced for the environment.
But it wasn't sustainable long term.
That's the issue. Uneven rainfall, the limestone soil depleting. The sources say this system eventually broke down.
And that had consequences.
Big ones. Oral tradition actually records a population decline around this time.
Interesting.
And you see increasing social stratification, different social levels emerging, probably as a way to manage those scarce resources.
Sure.
All before outsiders showed up.
Right. Speaking of outsiders, first European sighting, Captain John Fern, 1798.
Yep, aboard the British ship Hunter. He called it Pleasant Island.
Why Pleasant Island?
Apparently the locals seemed non-hostile, orderly. But here's a kicker. His original ship's log, the primary source, lost to history.
Ah, so we're relying on later accounts.
Exactly. And some early ones, like from Scottish geographers, were even wrong, claiming hills were 700 feet high. Clearly inaccurate.
So when did Europeans actually land?
First landing mentioned in the sources is British traders in 1830, just looking for trade opportunities.
But things soured fairly quickly. By 1840, it's on a blacklist.
Seems so. The sources suggest disappearing coconut trees, maybe overuse, maybe trade issues and low prices for copra. The dried coconut meat made it less attractive or maybe are contentious.
And the islanders got more involved in managing trade.
Yeah, it fell to a few traders, and the sources say the Nauruans got pretty adept at playing them off against each other.
Trying to get the best deal. Makes sense.
Then you start seeing missionary accounts later on. London Missionary Society, Central Pacific Mission, German Lutherans.
But there's a gap in the info about the traders' activities.
Seems like it, yeah. Not much detail until phosphate changes everything around 1900.
The big discovery.
Right. First formal mention seems to be an 1899 report from the Pacific Royal Society in Sydney.
What did it say?
It mentioned phosphates of ammonia in the Yarran area, but initially they thought it couldn't be ground up for fertilizer.
Interesting. What else was in that report?
Kind of a mixed bag. Mentioned local religious beliefs, noted a warlike disposition, referenced Nauru being used for blackbirding.
Forcing people into labor elsewhere?
Yeah. And it described the island pretty bleakly as the last moral stand. Quite the phrase.
That 1899 report mentioning phosphates must have set things in motion.
It seems to have been the trigger, yeah. Combined with an earlier 1886 survey that already suggested Nauru was rich in phosphate.
So German interest picked up fast.
Very fast. German merchants and company directors started negotiating a mining deal in 1887.
And they signed a deal with Nauruan chiefs.
Yes, the sources named Chiefs Edward Coinang and Colin Kinau. They signed a deed for phosphate mining in early 1888.
So it started commercially.
Initially, yes. But the German government's interest shifted quickly from just business to, well, colonial ambition.
They declared it a protectorate.
They did. Sent an expedition, and boom, mining officially starts in 1900.
There's a mention of the German hole.
Yeah, Iwo Rockface. Apparently, Nauruan elders used it for theological meetings. Shows that blend of old ways and new influences.
And the failure of earlier Christian missions might have played a role in Germany colonizing, a hidden agenda.
That's a fascinating angle the sources raise. It suggests the mission's lack of success might have provided part of the justification or maybe pretext for direct imperial control.
This period also saw other changes.
Definitely. Pastoralists arrived. Sources mention islanders losing communal property. Cotton was introduced, bizarrely enough.
And phosphate mining just kept expanding.
Big time. Output surged in 1901. A deep-sea pier was built in 1902. The infrastructure was ramping up.
And they even built a parliament house.
By 1905, yes, a parliament house, apparently similar to the one in Germany Guinea's capital.
Yeah.
Probably served as the center of German administration.
But German rule didn't last forever?
Nope. After the German Empire dissolved post-WWI, administration shifted. Australia took over.
How did things go under early Australian administration?
The sources mentioned the Great Depression hitting the economy hard and the trusteeship system that followed. It policed things, but sources suggest it kind of neglected the island's development needs after some initial repairs. More focused on control than progress, perhaps.
Then World War I brings another layer of disruption.
Huge disruption. Rumors of attack, the war escalating. It created a real crisis atmosphere.
Leading to an evacuation.
A dramatic one. September 15th, 1914. Nauruans and the German administrators were evacuated just as Allied ships arrived.
Where did they go?
Sailed for 76 hours, ended up in Kirikiri. That's where the Germans formally handed the island over to British troops.
So Nauru fell to the Allies very early in the war.
Effectively, yeah. And after the war, like other German colonies, it became a League of Nations mandate in 1920.
Administered by whom?
Australia took on the main administrative role under the overall British mandate. They set up a more modern government structure, but the sources are clear. The British were ultimately calling the shots.
Did Nauru gain any strategic significance during the war?
It seems so. The British occupied the German cable station there in September 1914, so it was a communications hub.
Okay.
And the sources mention Nauruan soldiers serving on troop transports and getting recognition, which is an interesting detail.
The post-war settlement really locked down control over the phosphate, didn't it?
Absolutely. The Treaty of Versailles gave German Pacific territories to the British Empire, administered by Australia under the League mandate.
And then specifics were sorted out in London.
Yes. March 1915. The British Empire basically assumed ownership of the phosphate reserves. They kicked out the Germans, acting on behalf of Australia and New Zealand.
Setting the stage for the BPC.
Exactly, the British Phosphate Commission. This arrangement really cemented their control over the island's main asset.
And this must have made the Nauruan community more vulnerable.
The sources suggest so. They couldn't really leave the island, and their access to traditional food sources, the sources use this phrase, disrupted edible vegetation properties, was affected.
Sounds like a difficult time.
Yeah, the sources describe it as a kind of moratorium period. Security and recovery under this new externally controlled system.
Okay, let's move forward. World War II brings another major power shift.
A huge one. September 27, 1940, months after the Pacific War technically started, Japan formally annexes Nauru.
Annexed? Wow.
Yeah, it became part of their South Seas Mandate. This changed things dramatically. A lot of the Japanese administration personnel actually moved to Japan later, leaving the Nauruans more reliant on imports, especially from Fiji.
And the Japanese occupied it very early, even before Pearl Harbor.
That's what the sources say. Early December 1941. They clearly knew Nauru and nearby Ocean Island were strategically important.
What was the priority under Japanese rule?
Initially, copra exports. The Nauruan government was directed to focus on that. They started building new wharves and stores, adaptable for phosphate too, from February 42.
So phosphate was still key for Japan.
Oh yeah, critical fertilizer for their rice production in Southeast Asia.
That's a major strategic resource.
Absolutely. The sources even suggest a possible agreement between Japan and Britain, despite being at war, for Britain to keep supplying phosphate ships for a while. Shows how vital it was globally.
So copra and phosphate exports continued.
For a time, yes, from both Nauru and Ocean Island.
Until the Allies started pushing back.
Right. The Allies captured Nauru in 1943 during their island-hopping campaign.
Did that stop production?
Pretty much. The war made things like copra less profitable anyway. Rubber was more important elsewhere. Japan basically abandoned production in Nauru by 43, though the islanders were still under Japanese control.
The sources mention a weird detail about confectionery.
Chuckles.
Yeah.
Yet specific. In 1944, apparently few copra shipments reached Japan, but some 850 tons were shipped to Nauru.
To Nauru, why?
To make palm oil byproducts to replace cocoa butter and sweets back in Japan. Resourcefulness in wartime, I guess.
Nauru was the last Pacific island invaded.
Right, that's what the sources state. After Allied wins at Guadalcanal and the Solomons, they started retaking islands. Shipping around Nauru was blocked from early 43, but Nauru itself wasn't a top priority.
What was the situation like on the island then?
Bleak. Supplies were low. Morale was down among the islanders. They were kind of cut off.
Until the Allies focused on it in late 44.
September 1944, yeah. The sources give troop numbers initially 1,200 Japanese, 100 Korean Chinese, later boosted to 1,000 Japanese, including specialists.
And treatment of prisoners was harsh?
Tragically so. The sources estimate 124 prisoners were murdered during the occupation.
So after the war, control shifted again.
Back to Australian administration, but this time under the new United Nations as a UN trust territory, finalized in February 1946.
So post-war, it's under UN trusteeship.
Exactly. Formalized in 1947, administered jointly by Australia, New Zealand, and the UK.
Who did most of the work?
Australia bore the main administrative load, though NZ provided some financial aid.
What was the justification for the trusteeship this time?
The sources are quite blunt. It was felt the island was seized for exploitation, and local control was only feasible after the phosphate ran out and mining wasn't viable anymore.
Wow, that's cynical.
It does sound that way, doesn't it? Basically planning for independence only after the main resource was gone.
How did administration evolve in the lead-up to independence?
Well, by the early 60s, government costs and employment shot up. A lot more administrative functions.
Did Australian policymakers start considering local views?
They began to, yeah, recognizing the need for local input and proper channels. This led to consultative bodies in late 64.
But what did they do?
Aimed to share legislative power between an elected parliament and the older appointed Council de Nauru.
And there were standing commissions.
Yes, advising the Australian administrator on things like health, education, works, post telegraphs.
Were Nauruans building their own capacity?
They started hiring their own technical staff, but the sources say problems remained in really developing that local expertise.
Were these reforms successful?
Not entirely smooth sailing. The Nauruan Council was seen as a bit ineffective, split along regional lines, didn't meet expectations.
And this fueled the independence movement.
Seems like it really accelerated it. The desire for independence, which sources say was previously negligible, suddenly mushroomed.
Interesting phrasing.
Yeah. And as Nauruans took more responsibility for local affairs, you got these dramatic incidents.
Like the miners' riot in '67.
Exactly. September 1967, Miners protesting being excluded from the proposed council and new bank legislation
What happened?
led to evacuations of Australians, businesses closing, 2 ministers sacked. A real flashpoint showing the pressure building for full Nauruan control.
So that momentum, plus the growth in the 60s, led to the successful bid for independence.
That's the trajectory. Hammer Dorober's election win in '68 was key. He's described as astute, charismatic.
And he led the charge for independence.
His efforts were central, yeah. The constitution they adopted was based on Australia's, crucially with support from all factions.
Mirroring the Australian system.
Largely. A National Assembly Council estate, House of Reps with equal representation, similar structure.
And guaranteed freedoms.
Yes, speech, religion, non-discrimination were enshrined in law. Nauru got its own magistrates' court, power to nominate a Supreme Court, though Australian courts still had a role initially. New arbitration courts, too.
Was continuity important for the transition?
Very. Public service agreements with Australia continued. Australia even offered advisors, teachers, doctors, etc. for support.
Why was that seen as important?
The sources suggest the idea was Nauruans would fit in after a learning period of total reliance on outsiders. Keeping the existing structure was seen as the safest path initially.
So Dorober focused on national issues first.
Language policy, health, education, jobs. But the sources stress this 1968 independence was primarily constitutional. Meaning financial, economic, social development were still largely seen as Australia's responsibility at that point. Full independence was still down the road.
Ah, right. Full independence finally achieved January 31st, 1976.
Correct. And that period between 70 and 76 is described interestingly in the sources as a UN trusteeship under Nauru.
What does that signify?
It suggests Nauru taking the internal lead, but still formally under that UN umbrella administered by AUDIS, NZ, and the UK. Australia kept control over foreign affairs and defense during this time.
But they helped Nauru prepare.
Yes. The sources detail extensive legal and administrative help from Australia, drafting laws based on their model. 1976 was the agreed target.
Nauru formed a distant countries group.
Likely referring to their early efforts to build diplomatic ties beyond the immediate region, preparing for the world stage.
And the independence agreement itself.
Designed to be unconditional. Full independence. Nauru controls its own cabinet, no more full-time Australian advisors embedded in government.
What about the ceremony?
Held in 2 parts, marked the lowering of the old flags. And right away, Nauru's new foreign minister was talking about their role at the UN, stepping up immediately.
So Nauru becomes independent, phosphate industry running. But this is where the boom and bust really kicks in.
This is the heart of it. Phosphate discovered 1899, German control, then the British Phosphate Commission, BPC.
And that 1913 treaty was key.
Crucial, according to the sources. Gave the commission immunity and control, but explicitly didn't share the wealth with Nauruans. Sources call it a breach of the protecting powers duty.
So the BPC make huge profits.
Immense returns, especially 1902-1912. And Nauruans themselves were largely banned from working in the industry.
Why? What was the reason given?
Stated reason was non-compliance with Australian international regulations. But it effectively excluded them from their own main resource.
How did Nauruans eventually gain control?
Things shifted. BBC returns declined, Australia got more involved, competition increased. Eventually, the BPC stopped production.
And a Nauruan entity took over.
Yes. January 28, 1989, the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust was formed, specifically to take control of all mining by Nauruans.
Did they get the BPC assets?
They did. April 5, 1989, they took over the assets of the Nauru Phosphate Commission, which was jointly owned by Nauru NZ UK.
And then they listed on the stock exchange.
Clyde shortly after, completed about 5 months later. This marked the start of the era of Nauruan control of Nauru's wealth and resources.
This should have been it, the moment they finally controlled their destiny.
You'd think so. But the sources describe what followed as a disaster.
What happened?
Massive misinvestment of that wealth on the international stock market in 1991, leading to the total collapse of the economy.
Just gone. How big was the deposit originally?
Underlay about 5.75 square miles, 6 to 570 feet thick on average. Estimates varied, maybe 200 million tons initially, though mining companies thought half that was recoverable.
And production peaked high but fell off.
Peaks of maybe 23 million tons here in the 60s, but down to under 6 million tons here by 75. The writing was on the wall.
And as wealth grew, so did costs.
Yep, more bank accounts, higher cost of living. The boom had its side effects.
What about post-independence economic policies?
Sources mention nationalizing foreign businesses briefly in 70, but quickly shifting to international partnerships and hiring foreign experts.
But Nauruans weren't really involved in managing the money.
That seems to be the core problem highlighted. Trust funds were invested by outsiders, records were opaque, sources say literally no Nauruan could understand them.
And this lack of transparency was a long-term issue.
Sources trace it back to 1921. A major factor, they argue, in Nauru ending up labeled a failed state.
So the profits meant for services were mismanaged.
Intended for education, healthcare, infrastructure, and initially it led to splendor. Big buildings trying to copy richer countries.
But they assumed the money would last forever.
Seems like it. When the phosphate ran out, the lack of sustainable investment proved disastrous.
Did they try other ventures?
Yeah, sources mention things like gambling computers, internet ventures, but with limited success and failure. Mostly failure.
The sources raise ethical questions about Nauru's ability to engage with global markets.
Grave questions, yeah. Equity, morality, accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Plus the huge cost of all those foreign advisors, lawyers, accountants.
And the environmental cost.
Stated starkly.
Yeah.
Mining destroyed the island. Plus falling mineral prices globally just made things worse.
It's just a brutal story of a resource curse.
Pretty much textbook.
Yeah.
But the sources also say, despite everything, Nauruans still believe in the right to that wealth and keep struggling for independence and identity.
And that struggle now includes huge environmental challenges.
Massive ones. Climate change vulnerability is top of the list. Low-lying land, limited fresh water.
Sea level rise is the big threat.
Critical concern. That source mentioning the 61-meter high point links it to a prediction. A 1-meter rise by 2100 could flood half the land, displace 90% of people, contaminate most fresh water.
Devastating potential.
It is. Coastal erosion is already happening, made worse by sea level rise, storm surges, threatens homes, the main drinking water lagoon.
And saltwater getting into the freshwater lands?
A huge regional issue, the sources call it, threatens the core drinking water supply.
Plus the damage from the mining itself.
Right. Overexploiting the guano caused huge distress, loss of fertile land, tables, sinkholes appearing, some even forming deep lakes.
The sources compare it to losing territory.
Effectively, yes. Land lost or made unusable. So Nauru's trying to find income while dealing with this degradation and waste disposal problems.
And energy dependence.
Heavily reliant on diesel generators, which emit CO2, contributing to the very climate change threatening them.
Any alternatives?
There's solar potential, but high population density makes big solar farms tricky. They're exploring options, though.
Okay, let's turn to the political landscape. A democratic republic parliamentary system.
Since 1968, yes, with changes along the way, Parliament has 18 members, 3-year terms.
And the president.
Elected from the MPs, by the MPs, for a 3-year term. No separate popular election for president, and no upper house in Parliament.
The political atmosphere sounds tense.
Sources describe a climate of fear and paranoia. Lack of strong, formal opposition parties groups exist, but aren't registered like parties elsewhere.
But they manage to coexist.
Somehow, yeah. Despite internal tensions and divides, they maintain coherence. But strife is common, sometimes spilling into violence.
Politics defined in tribal terms.
That's the phrase used. Suggests lineage and local loyalties are key. Civil society and media play limited roles.
The Nauru Inter-Party Agreement since 2007 is mentioned.
A significant feature of their recent politics. Parliament House is in Yaren, described as a single-story white building.
And rivalries are intense.
Bitter and personal, according to the sources.
No military.
None. Police force of about 40-45 people. Sources make a point of saying they aren't issued winged weapons, maybe meaning certain types of arms. Unclear.
Court system.
Supreme Court, District Court, local community court.
So the president is an MP leading a coalition government.
Correct. Appoints cabinet ministers from fellow MPs.
Looking at the 21st century, Nauru's been active internationally.
Seeking attention, yeah. Small island state forums, maritime security conferences.
They held the PIF presidency.
Pacific Islands Forum, yes, in 2000. Senator Renee Harris was prominent then, raising sovereignty issues, economic crisis, and the emerging issue of refugees seeking asylum in Australia.
Ah, the refugee issue. That put Nauru on the map.
Involuntarily, yes. The MV Tampa incident in 2001, then Australia establishing the offshore processing center there. Huge international spotlight.
How did Nauru handle it?
Requested Aussie police help, trying to publicize the situation via media, NGOs. PM Hilda Hine sought financial aid through the Pacific Forum.
Nauru's relationship with China and Taiwan has been complicated.
A real diplomatic seesaw, documented in the sources, recognized PRC initially, 1949,
Then switch.
to Taiwan, ROC, in 2002, seeking aid and attention post-phosphate collapse.
Then back again.
Back to PRC in 2010, hoping for benefits. China recognized them quickly.
And then?
Switched back to Taiwan in 2019 after a government change. But sources note COVID shifted attention, Taiwan's influence waned.
Australia sees Nauru as strategically important.
Very much so. Nauru's isolation from other major aid donors gives Australia significant leverage, which the sources say Canberra is eagerly following.
So it's a pawn in geopolitical games.
Sources frame it that way, part of a larger regional competition involving ADIUS, US, China, Taiwan. Using divide and conquer tactics, secret deals.
And discovery of manipulation can backfire.
It can lead to reduced influence or even switching recognition again, yeah.
Okay, let's shift to culture and identity. Distinctly Micronesian.
Even though it's geographically east of the main Micronesian islands, yes. The Nauruan language is Austronesian, Micronesian branch. Unique phonology.
Has it been studied much?
Limited study, but efforts to standardize it, create a written form using Latin alphabet since 1856.
Efforts to promote it.
The depth of education, estimated in 1971, pushed for it. Some use in schools, government, media broadcasts. But English still dominates reading material, giving Nauruan an inferior status according to the sources.
What about religion?
Historically, Protestant missions from Germany, then Australia, Seventh-day Adventists. American Baptists helped post-WWIOI.
But Western influences caused disruptions.
Sources suggest expectations of the new elite plus Western recreation led to incursions of isolation, people drifting from community activities. There's mention of an elite lament over disintegration and wanting to preserve identity.
A language declaration aimed to boost Nauruan.
By the Philately Numismatic Society? Yeah. Preserve, translate, give it prestige like English-German. Potential for textual domination, making it the main official language.
Traditional arts.
Chants, war dances, boisterous singing, drums, paintings of turtles, bones, fish, funerals, masks simple, grotesque, for good luck, like in basketball.
But can't be worn in public.
Except ceremonially, yeah. Belief they bring calamities otherwise, quite specific.
Indeed. Youth culture.
Wild chest-thumping chants described, mixing gaiety and malevolence, fiery songs against enemies, culture seen as a dynamic process, changing a lot in the last century.
Dance is important.
Key medium for beliefs, stories, cosmology. But concerned traditions are fading as youth encounter global culture via tech.
New forms emerging, though.
Celebratory, expressionist dance, electronic music styles. Ceremonies also changing, sacred songs kept, but contemporary, sometimes parodied, preludes added.
So culture in flux due to modern pressures.
Urbanization, migration eroding identity, nuances, loss of language, changes in youth interaction, gaming, ephemeral social friendliness, all seen as damaging the traditional close-knit clan.
Which leads to social issues and community development, debated since the 90s.
Since the 97 workshop, yeah. Persistent problems challenging the culture. A national survey looked at alcohol abuse, unemployment, mental illness.
Describing Nauru as a victim of its own prosperity.
Meaning the sudden wealth created new problems, ironically.
How's community development viewed?
Like a marriage needing input from both sides. Consultation happens, but there's a feeling that experts often impose solutions from outside, top-down approach.
Maybe a lack of local ownership?
Sources hint islanders might focus too much on failure, not success. Development plans get made but not implemented. Argument is islanders need empowerment to take the lead, write their own plans.
After 30 years of external efforts, a sense of powerlessness.
Powerless against the tide, as the sources put it. The alternative proposed is bottom-up. Start with community needs, build moral authority locally.
How to encourage that?
Ideas like a national essay contest. How I envisage Nauru's future. Give people a way to express their guts and opinions.
Okay, summarizing the big challenges Nauru faces today.
Stemming from that wealth to poverty crash, phosphate gone, governance issues, complex foreign relations, environmental rehabilitation needed.
Specific current challenges.
Economic pressure, need new income, not enough infrastructure or human resources. Improving governance. Regional pressures, PIF, on migration, aid, sustainability, plus that ongoing environmental work, the refugee asylum seeker situation, and global climate change pressure.
The core question is long-term viability, isn't it?
That's what the sources grapple with, moving from royalties to small investment income and aid. It looks bleak without significant returns.
Worse than other resource-depleted nations.
Sources note few lived quite as high on the hog as Nauru did during the boom. Economic collapse seems likely without new long-term income.
And the environment needs constant work.
Continuous restoration. Plus, the refugee challenges, social, political, legal, judicial, meeting the needs of this vulnerable group hosted on the island since late 2012.
Does hosting refugees affect Nauru's own progress?
Sources suggest potential setbacks to training Nauruans. Government programs also complicates relations with neighbors like Fiji, within PIF, and international agencies when seeking funds or support.
The financial picture sounds grim.
Dire in the second decade of the millennium.
Yeah.
IMF forecast impending bankruptcy. A lot blamed on that infamous onshore-offshore arrangement.
Meaning?
Huge sums from international fishing licenses deposited in the Nauru Trust Fund.
But poorly managed again.
Massively reduced in value. Hundreds of millions of the late 90s became a pittance by the time Nauruans fully controlled the assets. Policies of rigid conservatism didn't help. Missed opportunities for enterprise.
What about Australia's view on the refugee costs?
Sources say IRA's pointed to rising welfare costs for Nauruans while largely ignoring their plight related to managing the process center itself, a disconnect in perspective.
Restrictions on Nauruans talking to media.
Explicitly told not to. Described partly as trying to sanitize Roche's role, likely meaning the historical BPC role in the mining disaster, avoid blame.
Access to the island restricted too.
For tourists, others, citing security. But sources note journalist officials visited neighboring islands routinely, implying the reasons for Nauru's restrictions might be, well, complex.
Ultimately, the sources question Nauru's viability.
Given the size, population, geology, yeah. A tough outlook. Strong kinship ties exist. Nauruans are proud. But urbanization, migration are eroding identity, language, the clan structure.
And a paradoxical stance on climate change.
Escalating the issue internationally, partnering with Australia, while maybe not fully addressing internal vulnerabilities or the situation of climate refugees. Sources suggest Australia's engagement might highlight this potential hypocrisy. Bureaucracies aren't necessarily representing the concerns of the climate change vulnerable bourgeoisie.
We should also briefly touch on those two historical figures mentioned.
Right. Peter CEO, born 1928, chemist for the phosphate company, involved in public life, chief minister, MP diaries quoted, died 1985, controversy over his funeral.
And DTNC.
Born 1930, educated abroad, at College AS, Physics US, teacher, agricultural officer, acting chief minister, fought for independence but faced opposition, foreign affairs secretary, ambassador offer returned later, council member, launched fish farming, lives spanning huge changes.
So wrapping up the cultural side, Nauruan language preservation efforts continue against English dominance. Traditions like music, dance are vital but evolving.
And recent constitutional reforms codified national symbols, languages, government structures.
And environmentally. Sea turtles declining due to climate change, plastics, and those wall decorations reflecting ambitious sustainability goals.
Maximalist view, yeah, despite the immense challenges.
So what does this all mean? It's quite a journey we've traced.
From Pleasant Island through exploitation, immense wealth, then collapse, and now this struggle for viability.
We've really seen how geography, one resource, shaped everything.
And how external powers constantly influence things, while internal challenges mounted.
Which leaves us with a big question, really.
Given everything, the environmental damage, the economic uncertainty, the sources laid bare, the external pressures, what is the future for Nauru?
Is viability, as the sources question, truly achievable?
Or is Nauru a stark lesson about the limits small island nations face in our current world, especially those hit hard by resource exploitation and climate change?
Something to definitely mull over after this deep dive.